Hey everybody, Pete A. Turner, executive producer and host of your Break It Down show, talking to you today about our episode. Now look, all week long we've been doing some, not all week, but a lot of the week we've been doing some post-election coverage, just talking about some of the things they're not talking about on the mainstream media. So we've got a guy named Matthew Beebe on the show, and what he's going to talk to us about are the legal challenges and actually getting into like what's real, what's for sale, what's phony, because the fact is we have a system. And as much as we want to call Joe Biden the president-elect, the reality is that, Donald Trump gets to say, hold on, there's some trickery going on. I want to look into this. And so we're doing that legally. We have a system for this. And so instead of getting all fired up about who's doing what and what conspiracies there, we go to court and you have to prove things in court. And if you write an affidavit and you lie, that's illegal and people go to jail for that. And if you rig votes, that's illegal and people go to jail for that. So we just go through the whole conversation on the challenge of what's happening. And we released this show just the other day, so we want to keep it timely. And so the podcast is quickly following on its heels. Already, some of these things have started to evolve and change. Literally, as we were recording, the hearings, some of the hearings in Pennsylvania were being had with Donald Trump's attorney, Rudy Giuliani. So I think you'll like Matthew Beebe, very smart guy, writes for the Federalist. You can read his stuff there. Just type in Matthew, Beebe, Matthew Beebe. He's run for office before. He's a veteran, so I like that. He's also a stand-up comedian. He'll probably come back on the show in some capacity or another and continue to talk about his expertise. I'm in this really interesting group of people that are, skilled like Matthew is. They write for things like all kinds of magazines. And so I'm going to continue to bring these really smart folks on to talk about these things. And this is not a partisan show. So that's one of the things I hope all of you know. And if you're new to the show, we try not to do partisan things here. Sometimes our bias slips through, but for the most part, what I want you to hear is a rational conversation about stuff that, like, what do we really know? How does the system really work? All right, enough about that. Hey, it's the giving season. And so if you're inclined to, like a lot of people are, give this time of year to charity, I would ask you to consider Save the Brave. Here's what we do. We help veterans that have PTSD, and we help them to not want to kill themselves. This is obviously a very important thing. Our focus, this money goes towards helping these veterans directly. We are doing our best to always be upfront and open about that. You're always welcome to ask us about the bona fides of the charity. We are glad to do it. We work hard at this, and so when you invest that, you're investing in people that believe in what they're doing, are veterans, and we are trying to help our brothers and sisters and try to keep them alive, keep them safe, and keep them well. Okay, enough about that. I appreciate you guys. Oh, by the way, if you are going to do charity and Save the Brave isn't your thing, why don't you consider, and they're not paying me to say this, why don't you consider charity on top? It's a way to give charity to someone as a gift. Just think of it as a gift card. You can give a physical card, you can give an e-card. And basically, just like a gift card, you would say, hey, I want to do some charity for you, so here's $50. I've covered all the fees and transaction things, and here it is. You can cash this in at any one of any charity, basically. And you go to CharityOnTop.org. You can buy a gift card there. That is another great way to give. It's a great holiday gift. Like, hey, we're going to give $5 gift cards. Well, just get a charity gift card and go. There you go. Everybody gets a chance to give. You get to help someone else be charitable, and it's good for everybody. All right, one more thing to say to you. Here comes Matthew Beebe.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Cruz.
This is Bryce Vine.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This
East.
is Sebastian Younger.
This is Daryl.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
This is Dr. Bob Greenberg.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Will Riley, and you're watching the Break It Down Show with Pete Turner.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
This is Matt Beebe, and you're watching the Break It Down Show.
So I belong to this group. It's like I don't know. How would you describe what type of group is this?
Oh, I thought it was a secret society. I thought
I'm not saying the name. I'm not saying how we meet or anything else. Just how would you describe it?
Right. Hypothetically speaking, I think it's a little bit of a right of center, but it's a good group of people that get together and dialogue on the different issues of the day. We bring a lot of different perspectives to it, and everybody kind of chimes in. Sometimes everybody lurks, other times. But it's been an interesting group to be a part of, for me at least. For sure.
Yeah, and it's especially because of the exodus from Facebook for a lot of people. Ultimately, I probably wouldn't be on Facebook except for the friends capacity, which I try to stick to. But it's
it's neat to be able to be like when you get the bios from all these people. For the most part, we're all just in a crowd, not looking at one another and just reading our stuff. So you don't really know who's in there, and you're like, holy cow, holy cow, holy cow! I better step my game up, you know.
There's some pretty cool people in the group, right? So I am often humbled by the fact that there are some really deep thinkers, and every once in a while we'll get somebody that'll just kind of roll in there with some of those aha moments. And sometimes I feel like I can contribute. We'll see.
Yeah, well, the reason why we're having the conversation starting with this is because in this group, a lot of these ideas, we discuss current events, and there's a lot of people that have specific knowledge for that current event. And you've been writing about post-election analysis legally on what's going on. You know, we've got this, someone did a "You Are Here" map, I think on Twitter somewhere, and it's like, you know, first you hold an election, then people vote, and then, you know, you count the votes, and then you are here. And then a lot of the media is way over here saying we've decided already, but we haven't decided. And I'm not making a statement politically about anybody. It's that we have a process. It is a very close election. And part of that process involves going to the courts and trying to determine, you know, just what is going on. And if we can't tolerate that, then we have a bigger problem than who won the election.
No, I absolutely agree. And I think we are so polarized as a society today, and that's a whole nother episode, right? That we could talk about the rationale for why and how we kind of climb out of that. But when we're looking at everything being politicized like it is in our society today, and we every 4 years convene nationally, kind of have this appointed day, right, to select who will be our president and vice president. We probably should take that a little more seriously than some in the media, and maybe even some across the political spectrum. There's sort of either you're closing ranks and turning into this circular firing squad, or you're just random fire everywhere. And what I've tried to do is take a little bit more of a closer look at what's the merit of some of these arguments that the Trump campaign's putting forward. What's the actual process that's supposed to be followed, and is it healthy for our democracy to wrestle with this, or should we just kind of turn the page? And I fall down on the side, and we'll talk about here in a minute, that we really need to take a breath. I've said the only way through it is through it. And I think it's good for our society, good for our democracy, to wrestle with some of this stuff and work through it in an orderly way.
Before the election, because I'm some kind of prognosticator, my big prediction was, most of us will be pissed. And we'll for sure have to go to court to decide this thing. No matter who wins, there was going to be a legal fight no matter what. What is it about these legal fights that everybody knew were at least a strong possibility? What is it that makes half of us reject that path that, hey, why don't you just give up, whoever it is, whichever side it is?
Right. Well, I think it's the other half that makes us react that way, right? Yeah. If we go back, there's this deep national wound going back to the 2000 election with Bush v. Gore. We hear this selected, not elected mantra that some on the left really still, will argue. They'll tell you that now Bush was an illegitimate president. And then there are some that, sit back and say, hey, Kerry, and he had Ohio stolen from him, and he was a bigger man, so Bush stole his second term too. That's a smaller group of rabid partisans, I guess, on the left that see it that way. But there were at least some elements to both of those claims. Then we had, the 8 years of Obama, where it wasn't the same type of illegitimacy, but there were those on the right who thought his election and his political ascendancy was illegitimate in certain ways. And then we've got Donald Trump, and we had Russia. Everybody got kind of tired of that. And so there's this deep volley back and forth that we've done. Now, you talk about your prognostication there. One of the things that I said in print just before the election was my prediction was it's all going to come down to the city of brotherly love. And I sort of expected Pennsylvania to be a street fight. And as it turns out, that may or may not be electorally or outcome determinative, I think is what the legal experts are saying. In other words, it may or may not ultimately affect the election outcome. But what we're fighting about there in the courtroom in Pennsylvania is the same thing we've been fighting about for 20 years. And I think that's where it gets real important that we sort of take a step back, breathe, and then really think about what's best for how we kind of sort through all this.
And let's get above the election level, and go to where the big problem is, and see if we can't, hit it in the belly button. It seems to me that no matter what side you're on, as long as your side loses, you believe the elections are compromised in some way. When you win, you don't care. You're like, hey, we won. So I'll forgive both sides for that. But there's not really an effective mechanism to compel states to, after Bush v. Gore, and there was some update in how we did these things. I think we got rid of Chads because we recognized that was not a thing. But it seems like we do need a good, firm scrub down of what is happening. Especially after, I'll say this, the left compromises the integrity of the election by pushing ballots out, millions and 100 million plus ballots out. And we know that creates opportunities for people to do something that's less than honest. So,
yeah, there's no doubt. So I've had, a bunch of dialogue with, left to center and far left friends and take a step back. And if I were to tell you that, and this is not sort of subjective, I'm gonna make up some numbers here just for the illustrative purposes. But we know that the mail-in ballots skew to the Democrat side. We saw that in fact, that was why everybody was actually, if you were paying attention, you weren't surprised. But that was why we saw election night leads for Trump. And then as the absentee ballots were tabulated, that lead decreased. And in fact, Biden eclipsed him in several of these swing states. That's because these absentee ballots sort of swing towards the Democrats' favor. Some of that's ground game. Some of that's reflective of how their voters tend to engage the electorate. Some of that's COVID related. But even going back before COVID was on the scene, that was advantage Democrats. It has historically been that way. So now if I would have told you last summer that Donald Trump had implemented a process, and by the way, let's just put a number on that. Let's say it's 2-1. In some states, it is actually even more in the advantage of Biden in the absentee ballots. But let's say it's 2-1. And in last summer, Trump put forward a whole bunch of processes and lawsuits and challenges that closed that gap and was going to put barriers to vote. You would have the left screaming bloody murder, screaming voter suppression, because he was trying to improve his outcome with absentee ballots. Now, the thing is, if that would have outraged you, and if you're talking to your sort of left-leaning friends that say, oh, he's got no case, he should have just gone out there and hustled better to get absentee votes, he shouldn't have down-talked absentee balloting, right? Take a break. If he had done that, you would have freaked out, right? I think that's a reasonable thinking person would have done the same.
As soon as you said Trump, freak out is the appropriate response.
Yeah, for sure, right? Now, let's look at the record. Let's look at what happened last summer in several of these battleground states. There was lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit to compel through litigation, not legislation. Now, there were some legislative changes that happened in Michigan and Pennsylvania by Republican dominated state legislatures, at least Republican influenced state legislatures that tweaked how they were going to do that. Now, that's fine if we do that legislatively. Now, some of the things that were done were empirically stupid because they didn't have a real well thought out plan, but it's legitimate, right? Then the left, in many cases, pursued litigation, what you'll hear a lot of people term as lawfare. They're sort of conducting warfare through the courts to change that, to really, frankly, take every element of election security, that had been in place related to absentee ballots, whether it be signature verification, whether it be ballot request process, whether it be how the envelope is stuffed, folded, unfolded, all of these different rules that are put there in place, by the way, with a rational basis. Let's think about that. They understand, those legislatures understood, and it was in their prerogative to say, we think this might be a little riskier than showing up at the polls with your ID. I think thinking people would say, yeah, that probably is. Not to say they're all illegitimate, not to say that they're wreaked with fraud, but there's an opportunity for malfeasance. So we're going to raise the bar a little bit higher to mitigate that. And that's what those state legislatures did. Now, the courts and in some cases unelected bureaucrats. In the case of the Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, just disregarded what the legislature had put in place and dropped all of those barriers protecting most of those ballots. Now, did that mean?
But don't go another step further. Yeah. I want you to back up and say that last part again in a different way so we can all understand what you just said. Let me try first. You're saying that we ruled by judicial fiat, a certain set of parameters, which were maybe a step or two higher security wise, because pushing an unsolicited ballot out creates a lot of problems. And we don't do this normally. And the history of doing this, like, I don't know, did we ever even decide who won the Iowa delegates for the Democratic Party? I don't know that we ever did. So the court's like, yes, let's do this, but let's make it here because there's like a three-legged stool as I see it. You have suppression, you have enfranchisement, and then you have opportunities for fraud, right? And you have to secure the election. So you don't want to suppress votes, but you also don't want to invite fraud. And it gets to be really a problem if you make one leg taller than the others. And this passion for enfranchisement it also doesn't create educated voters. But please say it again. And did I get this right?
No, I think you got it right. I want to emphasize one other point too, because why this argument is important isn't just so that we have an accurate outcome, right? It's so that we have a believable outcome. And those are two different things. And that's kind of been the thrust of a lot of my argumentation on this, is that the believability of the outcome is frankly more important than the actual outcome. I know partisans on both sides would say, no, but in reality, for the republic, for our democracy, for this American experiment, if we no longer trust the basic premise that elections are to be believed and transfer of power and all that sort of stuff is appropriate. Now, to your point, what we saw was legislatures enact certain standards in an attempt to both secure the outcome of the election so that it would be more secure, but also so that it would be more believable. And then we had unelected bureaucrats and state courts intervene and say, no, COVID, voter suppression, all sorts of different arguments that were used. But ultimately, we dropped our guard in all of these battleground states. And that's kind of something that I think people forget, is if you're not in one of these battleground states where all of these changes were made last minute, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nevada, of course, Pennsylvania, Georgia, if you weren't part of that, if you're in what I would call, I'm here in Texas, I would call more of a normal state. Some might argue that. But what you experienced with your balloting and your voting, whether it was in present or absentee, is very, very different from what happened in several of these states. I had an argument and good conversation with a family member who has been an election judge, an election volunteer for years and years in the state of Ohio, and that person was unable to, initially say, no, we do it. That's not what they do in Pennsylvania. All of those procedures that you put in place in Ohio after the 2004 debacle up there, and it appears that Ohio has done a great job. All of those things that they did in Ohio isn't what happened in these other states. So it's chaos in some ways, and chaos breeds confusion. Confusion breeds opportunities for mistrust and even the conspiracy theories as well. And so that's kind of where we're at today, I think, because of those changes. And I don't think they were good changes. Empirically, I think you can look at them and say, why would they have done that? And that's kind of the reality that we're at right now. And some of those lawsuits are ongoing, and some yet to be filed, if you believe some of what the president's team has tweeted.
Yeah, and we can get to that in a moment. I want to cover this ground one more time because it's pretty remarkable to me. Yes, we want to make sure people can vote, but if you're going to, as an unelected official, say, hey, we're going to lower this bar to create, you are now, right or wrong, you are now inviting a lawsuit. You are inviting an injunction, some kind of, there's going to be at least, and these are always multi-pronged attacks. There's always multiple things that you can cite and reference. I mean, I'm not a lawyer at all, but that's just what I know. There's always something. And then I'm trying to be careful not to be too partisan, but no, this is a fact. So I'm just going to say this, and you know me, we've talked on the phone. I'm really big on like when you do contentious things and like an election, it is by definition like it's contentious. You have to be above reproach if you want to stand above the fray and say, no, I don't care who wins, But the I think it's Secretary of State of Pennsylvania or for Philadelphia, literally before the election said there was no way Donald Trump can win.
Yeah.
Why on earth would you compromise yourself like that, especially going in, that a legal fight is a legitimate, I don't want to say likely, but a legitimate thing, and you've just put yourself in a really bad position if I'm a judge, I don't care about politics. I hear you say that, and I'm like, this stinks. I don't like it. This is a razor's edge. Guess what I'm doing? I'm siding on the other side. Okay, I'm going to shut up and let you talk.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point to emphasize is that we have a lot of careless. I mean, let's step aside and take one of the criticisms of the president for the last 4 years, right? Is that he, maybe is intemperate with his words, maybe not as well thought out in what he says, right? I don't see anybody really, even the most hardcore Trump supporters necessarily arguing against that, right? That is one of his things. Now you've got all these other folks doing the same thing, right?
Right.
They freak out by him. There's no excuse for that kind of talk, right? There's no excuse for a lack of transparency. Daylight is the best disinfectant. And so that was one of the things that, really frustrated me, because I've had, I don't know, we have time to get into it, but I've had some experience here locally where we had a big blow up with some election observers, and it got real ugly, and really it boiled down to the fact that people were just jerks to each other, and that's what you see in a lot of these videos and a lot of the affidavits, where poll worker Smith was a jerk to poll watcher Jones. And so that breeds the resentment that, and then the internet gives it a life of its own. In many cases, a lot of those claims, I think, will be and are being adjudicated in ways that are pretty clear that these were just a-holes being a-holes on both sides. And polite, temperate remarks, transparency shouldn't be something that is that difficult, but apparently it is.
Yeah, and then we can talk more about that. But when you act the entire lead up to the election like no holds are going to be barred, and you have people that look, I'll call it straight out, Adam Schiff is a liar. I've said that publicly a lot of times. That guy, and he's not the only politician that lies, but the dude cannot stop releasing classified information publicly. He cannot put two facts together. And so this guy lies and starts an investigation. Whether or not Donald Trump did anything wrong, we're starting with a guy who's a liar right from the start because he's compromised himself so many times. The right does this too. There's a lot of liars in D.C. I mean, it's a fact. But when you have these people doing these things, it brings doubt into an election. And then, now we get affidavits and people like that Olympic wrestler who's like, hey, I didn't vote in this election, but I did. And this is the problem of trying to prove the negative, right? Like, no, if you don't care to even check to see if you voted and you didn't, because that's your vote, is to not vote. There could be hundreds of thousands of people or thousands of people in the right spot that are voting without ever even knowing. And now you have to prove that. It's work you can do, but it's not work that decides an election.
Well, and we shouldn't be surprised that a complex process, I mean, it's not complex in the sense that, hey, I go in there, I pick, Joe or I pick Donald, right? But it is complex when you talk about the scale that these things happen at. So we shouldn't be that concerned that there are administrative errors and confusion and some of that sort of stuff is kind of baked in. But what we should do is be very upfront and honest, clear, say, oh, yeah. What we found in the Georgia recount just yesterday, that somehow they messed up and forgot to tabulate or include one of the memory cards from one of the tabulators during their early voting period. That's a pretty big problem. They did catch it. Now, interestingly enough, they wouldn't have caught it if they hadn't done the manual recount. That's a little bit of a concern because those types of errors are supposed to be sort of engineered out through the checks and balances of the canvassing process. And apparently that one had sort of slipped past the goalie. That's a concern, but I don't think that's necessarily election altering. But I applaud on the one hand what Georgia has done to be more transparent, but there's also some things and it's always this, kind of peeling back the onion. I like to say, the deeper you peel the onion back, the stinkier it gets and the more your eyes water up. But sometimes it's good, right? So we need to do that.
And I just want to say this for the record, I'm pretty progressive across the board. If you ask me on a given topic, like I'm a military guy who's got as much field time as anybody, I don't at all care if you're transgendered, as long as you are either a pro or are working to become one, will shut up and do the job you're told to do. That's my requirement. I don't care what you call the thing between your legs. I don't care as long as they're adults. I don't care what you bump against somebody else's, the thing they call between. I don't care as long as you can do your job.
Well,
so when I say
these
things, and I say I'm not political.
You shouldn't have to care about all those things to care about free and fair elections, right?
Yeah, right. I'm just saying there's a whole lot of left in me, and there's some right, and there's a whole lot of middle. And what I do know is I don't know. Doug brings up a good question here. I talked earlier about sending out millions of unsolicited ballots. He said they send out applications, not ballots. And even this, I don't know. Is that true? Is that true in this county versus that state?
Right. So in Michigan, there's the Secretary of State up there took liberties. Okay, nothing against the law, but took liberties to say, you know what, we're going to actually send out ballot application requests to everybody. Okay, that's not illegal. Might be a little bit of shifting of that playing field in a way that helps Democrats, I think is empirically true. But those weren't ballots. In some of the states, they actually did send out actual ballots. Blanket, and so we'd have to do a state-by-state accounting to know that. But that's correct. In some of the states, that is all that they did. But again, go back to that illustration I made at the beginning: is if Donald Trump had done anything, either administratively or legally, that tilted the playing field to his advantage, we would have, riots. We had riots in the streets all summer, right?
Yeah.
But we would have riots in the streets about how terrible that was that he was doing that. What has happened here, whether legally, illegally, or in this quasi, judicial fiat sort of realm, a bunch of things that I absolutely tilted that playing field towards Democrats. Now, was that illegitimate? That's more of a philosophical question, because that becomes the question: is should everybody vote? Well, we've sort of accepted that as a universal thing, So now the question is, how much effort should the state put in place to drag people kicking and screaming to the polls, or to force them, or to sit them down? How easy do we want to make it? I don't know the answer to that, because I think that's fundamentally a philosophical question. But I do know that playing field was tilted. Whether it was constitutionally impermissible.
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business, or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at Pete A. Turner,
or at JohnLG69.
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
Whether it was constitutionally impermissible, that's going to be what's going to play out in courtrooms, at least in Pennsylvania today. I think actually it's going to start in 6 minutes. They've got their initial hearing on that, merry-go-round in the Pennsylvania proceedings.
Well, and again, these things may not affect or impact ultimately this election. Maybe the horse is too far out of the barn, and these things, are dealt with later. But it is something that we need to deal with. I mean, I don't want to deny anybody their vote. I am for felons getting the right to vote back. I'm for that. Look at me. I'm a hippie. But I am not for flooding the marketplace. I don't care who it favors. I'm not for mass incentive. Like, if you're going to get people to vote, go out and do the damned work. Don't compromise the election by sending out things where, like, hey, my neighbor's mailbox is literally 2 inches, because I put both of them up 2 inches from mine, and all I've got to do is go out and be on the lookout, and there's one, there's one. And I always say, as a spy, you give me $5 million and identify which counties you want flipped, done. I will get them flipped, And someone who needs $500 more than they need to, they're willing to risk it. You could do a lot of things with a small amount of money. Is that happening? I don't know. But what I am saying is that there's a lot of opportunity. We're putting a lot of trust into a lot of people and a lot of systems that aren't really ever tested. And when we do test them, what do we always find? Like, talk about the state of Texas's efforts to use these machines that are used in a lot of states and how they continued to fail when they did a dry run.
Yeah, well, and so, my time in the Air Force, I was a systems guy, mostly in cyber defense, but we did some communication security stuff for some big national capabilities. And one of the things that underlies good system design, system engineering practices, especially when humans are involved, are fail safes, check safes. Do we have a process that keeps this? So if my process of counting ballots is prone to failing in a particular way, what is the double check that I have in place? So those sorts of things are reasonable. Now, what happened in the case of Dominion voting systems here in Texas is our Secretary of State, they did an analysis with the Attorney General's office involved and came back and said, you know what, there's some errors. Now, remember, just because Texas elected not to use the Dominion systems doesn't mean it's this blanket indictment that they're hacked by Hugo Chavez and the Venezuelans, which is one of the attack lines. Maybe they are, right? But it's not unreasonable for us to say, wait a minute, there's some stuff in there that is prone to being abused. So you should not have a system of this importance for our nation that depends on the good faith of people that could be bad actors, right? And that's why we need to have some of those checks and balances in place. Some of those are, in fact, playing out now with recounts and recanvasses and manual counts. But what we're talking about in the courtroom isn't so much the mechanics in the X's and O's of how the vote was tabulated and recorded and reported, right? That's a whole class of potential problems that are real, right? I don't want to downplay that. But what's happening in the courts are more on the side of sort of the front end. How did we get to that point? Did we illegally change the rules at the last minute? Did we usurp the authority of the state legislatures from a judicial and executive standpoint to make it easier for Democratic aligned voters to engage in voting? I think we did. I want to dive deeply into the legal part as we get to the second part of the show here, but I also want to continue to canvass the landscape and to prove your point about what if Donald Trump did this. We know that the adversarial nature of this, and then I'm going to be critical of the people that are like Donald Trump cannot get anything right. When you do that, you're now unreasonable because of course he gets something right. So like when and I saw a quote somewhere, I can't place who it was or what they said, but it was a postal official, and they said, yes, we're getting rid of some mailboxes because the flat out answer is nobody uses them. They're literally empty, right? And so, but that was turned into a political narrative, not an improvement of the system. And then it appears that the mail service was not a significant problem. Have they contributed to some counting problem? Okay, maybe, but the mass cry that came from the left hasn't proven out to be true, but it's still real in a lot of their minds that this was done to usurp the election. And then the other thing I wanted to say about the machines for counting votes is Hillary Clinton's people, if not herself, questioned the legitimacy of the same machines that are being questioned. And I say all of these things to say both sides argue when they're not on the winning side, and there is an accounting that needs to be done. This is not a simple thing where, hey, Joe Biden won, get over it, suck it up. No, there's a lot of contention. And one thing I've learned from combat zone time is the specter is always worse than the actual problem. So maybe the problem is small, but it is growing out from that, this bigger problem where you cannot tell people that the election wasn't robbed from them, or you cannot tell people that this clearly is a win for their guy. So I wanted to say those things to kind of wrap up this landscape. This is complex. This is not easy. And when we talk about legal things, you are often talking about minutia. And sometimes you file the suit just to get the words into the court to establish groundwork for something else. Even if you lose it, you're just trying to work your way through these problems. Talk to us a little bit about what you see going on in Philly or whatever areas. Okay, so there's ongoing lawsuits by everybody and their brother that saw something bad happen that has enough to pay the filing fee and engage an attorney, right? So there's a whole bunch of wheat and chaff that's sort of shaking out. And of course, all the, Trump's lawsuits are getting swatted down. He's got no merit. Well, there's actually only a couple that the Trump campaign has actually filed or participated in. So there's a very small subset. There are a whole bunch of what I would call uncoordinated, throw something at the wall because you were outraged kind of lawsuits that are being dismissed, right?
Yeah.
So there are ongoing lawsuits in several of the contested states that the Trump campaign has alleged or promised, I guess, depending on how you want to interpret their words, that there are more coming. But the main one that I think really is, well, it's further along in the process, let's just say, is what's happening in a Pennsylvania courtroom, or I think it's a Zoom room now, right? As we speak. And that's the argument that the Pennsylvania Secretary of the Commonwealth put in place changes to the way that the legislature had prescribed the elections. And it did two things from a constitutional legal standpoint. One is that caused an impermissible unequal treatment of voters. So we have an equal protection under the Constitution that's guaranteed. If anybody really wants to get down into the weeds, in 2000, Bush v. Gore had a whole bunch of stuff thrown at the wall. But the essence of the finding there was we really can't permit a state court to allow a process to unfold that is going to result in disparate treatment and an equal protection violation. And so that was why the Supreme Court said, time out, we can't continue this recount. You're not doing it in a way that is reflective of the constitutional protections there. So that's one claim. That's really, frankly, the major, primary, maybe even arguably the only claim that the Trump campaign is hinging that lawsuit on. Now, I want to talk about the second claim for a second here, but admit full well that earlier in the week, or late last week, it all blurs together, the Third Circuit held that this was not a permissible argument for the Trump campaign to bring. So let me talk about that for a quick second. So the second argument, which was actually put forth by Chief Justice Rehnquist in the Bush v. Gore proceedings in 2000, was that Article 2 of the Constitution is very explicit when it grants the authority for the selection of presidential electors to the state legislatures. Now, there's a great rich tradition of the Supreme Court of the United States yielding to state courts with respect to interpretation of state laws and statutes. It's kind of that federalism, kind of balance of powers. There's that tradition. But one of the areas, there are a few, but one of the areas where the Supreme Court has saw fit to say, we have actually sort of a veto authority, so to speak, here, is where there's something called out explicitly in the Constitution, like the Presidential Electors Clause. And so the argument of the Trump campaign was by having a ministerial appointee of the executive, the Secretary of State or the Secretary of the Commonwealth in Pennsylvania isn't even elected. In some states, the Secretary of State is an elected official. Then that person and a whole bunch of lefty groups, you can't look at who was pushing these lawsuits and not recognize that this was an intentional lefty push to kind of change these rules. But setting aside that, if we want to be straight down the middle, the Secretary of State and the state courts came back and said, the legislature didn't really mean that. Or if they meant it, it really doesn't apply here because we need to do a COVID thing. Or they were unclear here, so we'll go ahead and interpret it in a very specific way. So the argument, the Article 2 argument, is that the state courts and the executive branch of the state has no right to do that. They can't. It's the legislature is prime there. Now, what the Third Circuit held was it's the state court or it's the state legislature that would have to bring that suit. And so far, the General Assembly in Pennsylvania has not seen fit to participate in the Trump lawsuit. So that second claim, while I find it persuasive, In fact, as a separation of powers guy, that I think we've lost this, the abdications and usurpations of the way that we allowed judicial supremacy to reign. I think anytime we can roll that back is a good thing, right? So I'm disappointed to see that cause not advance, but it appears that cause isn't really likely to go anywhere in the Pennsylvania case. So that brings us back to this equal protection claim that the campaign is making, and believes that is significant enough to do one of two things: either completely carve out 600,000-700,000 votes, and I don't know as a practical matter how that would even work. They could conceivably retabulate those so that they would know how many to subtract, but I don't see honestly that being a practical solution. So what I think, if they prevail, and if it gets to the Supreme Court and they are amenable to the argument the Trump campaign is making, they would prohibit the Secretary of State from certifying the electors that were the result of that election, which I don't know. That's a pretty big deal. It doesn't necessarily mean that Pennsylvania's 20 electors are out of the mix. It just means the state legislature now has a problem. There's a big turd in the punch bowl, right? And so how do they react to that? Yeah. How do they come back and fix that? Now, to me, it would be fine from a constitutional standpoint if the Pennsylvania legislature convened, looked at the facts, and then awarded the electors to Joe Biden, because that is what they thought. Now, the Republican legislature of Pennsylvania doing that, everybody assumes would be a terrible thing and it wouldn't happen, and they would hand the election to Donald Trump. I don't think that's necessarily assumed. Now, if they're persuaded that the potential of fraud and the usurpations of their authority was so significant that it altered the election, then in fact they would have a strong case. But remember, they have to answer those same voters. So there's a pretty strong check and balance there, that the people closest to the voters of Pennsylvania having to sort of have a little bit of a do-over to figure out administratively and procedurally how to submit valid electors isn't necessarily the worst thing. Okay, so we're way off in a field here of the core findings, or the core arguments. Let me recap. So there's two major arguments. There's one that says, hey, they did a whole bunch of stuff and it caused disparate treatment of voters. Constitution says equal protection. What they put in place is impermissible. Hey, Supreme Court, overturn this election. Second argument is what they did was a violation of the Pennsylvania General Assembly's unique plenary authority under the U.S. Constitution, and so therefore that usurpation is impermissible. If they're not going to stand up and fight that battle for themselves, the Third Circuit has said that the Trump campaign can't do it on their behalf.
Yeah, and we're talking just Philadelphia in this case.
Well, just Pennsylvania, Philadelphia being the primary.
Okay. But we still got to deal with Michigan and Georgia and all these other places as well too. And we probably won't get to all of that in this episode. But you're laying down the exact thing that I wanted to do, and I wanted to go back to the equal treatment of ballots, because this has gone through the Supreme Court, and if there's a challenge to that, I would think that the Supreme Court takes that on, and you put a nugget in there that I wanted to highlight. We are really bad, and this is assuming that the state legislature will always fault to partisan sides, that the Supreme Court will always find against the thing that I want because of partisanship. But that doesn't prove to reliably be the case, and we're really bad at looking back and saying, just this past year, or maybe it was in 2019, recently the Supreme Court had this case where they were trying to decide on that law from the 60s, in terms of did it apply today to modern times, in terms of protection of people who were gay and a variety of other things, right? And everybody on the left assumed that the Supreme Court would get this wrong because of partisan natures. And really what they were arguing, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think I read these things because I want to know what happens. They were arguing, is this law valid, or was it written in a time before the context of today? And the Supreme Court said, no, it's valid. You can apply it in this fashion. So one, that goes against what the left was gnashing their teeth about. Shame on you guys for not saying, hey, they stood up and did what they're supposed to do. And two, even if they did find against it, it just goes over to the legislature. Hey, update this law so that it accounts for modern times. This is what happens all the time. But we're really bad at looking at what the state, I mean, who even knows what a state legislature does day to day anyhow, right? None of us. But we just assume that it's going to go against us. This is part of that specter that causes us so many fits.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I always talk about two sides of the same coin. We talk about usurpations of the courts, but there's an abdication that's kind of the flip side of that. Our legislature, especially Congress, how dysfunctional is Congress? They've abdicated their responsibility
to everybody else.
Yeah, absolutely. The administrative state on the executive side gets to, basically make law as a bureaucracy. In many cases, Congress has essentially delegated that authority to them. And then they sit idly by when the Supreme Court rules or writes law or rewrites law, those sorts of things. And yeah, there's an appropriate role in the argument for criticism of judicial activism and interpretation strategies for the Constitution, whether it's a living document or a originalist. Those are good arguments to have, but Congress doesn't need to actually have those arguments. Congress has the authority in most of the cases to step forward and say, okay, we're going to do it this way then. And likewise with the state legislatures. So if they would sort of find their way and be more willing to step forward and assert their authority, I think that would be a good thing. Truthfully, they're closer to the people. They're accountable by the people. So that shouldn't be something we fear, even if it's uncertain, right? So now we've got to think about how 435 people are going to vote instead of 9 people in robes are going to vote. So what? Right? Yeah. Which is a more legitimate outcome? The closer to the people you get, I think you have a claim that it's a more legitimate outcome.
Are you working on some battery-powered headphones at all? Because it sounds like the sound has gone a little bit like low on battery power. So.
No, I'm sorry. Maybe I shifted a little bit.
I don't know. Well, we'll see if it goes away or not. We'll deal with it if we have to. Right now, we'll just tolerate it.
All right.
Okay, then the other thing I wanted to ask about in terms of the legal challenges is there's like these procedural things that we're talking about right now where, hey, you guys changed the rules to this, and the other side's going to say, hey, it's because of COVID, what are we going to do? And as a judge, you're like, yeah, you know what? This has never been considered before, so what am I going to do here, as I sit on the court? These things are important, but are there another across the board? Are there another flavor of? Actually, I wanted to get back to the equal processing of these ballots because you said words like plenary and all kinds of things like that. So, what you're saying is when you get a box of ballots that come in, from mail-in ballots, and then you get a box of ballots that come in as absentee, and then you get a bunch of on-hand ballots that are paper, and then ballots that are electronic in some cases. You have to process them in as close as you can the same manner. You can't treat them in different ways, and that's what the Trump campaign is saying is that of these 700,000, you guys didn't do that. Like we've already established that. So 2 parts of this question. One, in the Supreme Court, when they found this in President Bush's favor, were there any of the existing judges who were more left-leaning in their decisions in favor of this equal protection? And 2, what do you think? What do we do if it is these 700,000 votes? What's the most likely outcome? Like, what's a judge going to say? Like, hey, there's nothing we can do about this. This is just a bad one. Proceed. Thank you. Like, I just kind of pocket veto it.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting. And I had. Well, let me answer the first part of the question first. So remember, it was a 7-2 verdict.
Nice.
Bush v. Gore, right? And so there is a pretty good belief, and I think it's a fair prediction, that if disparate treatment is shown in a significant way, that will probably have that argument prevail at the Supreme Court. Now, whether there's a threshold there that is in play or not, I think that's anybody's guess at this point in time. I mean, invalidating 700,000 votes seems to be a bit of a stretch. I mean, that's a pretty heavy lift, and I would be surprised to see the Supreme Court take that on, right? I think what is much more likely that they would do is they would say, you've screwed this up. This is impermissible. You can't move forward with these electors. Even that is a pretty big deal, but they haven't chosen sides. And so when you see judicial restraint, especially on that kind of issue where half the country is going to hate you on which way you decide, to say, you know what, you guys messed this up, go back and figure it out yourselves. I think that's more likely than not how they would choose to resolve it, just because it kind of makes more sense just from a strategic standpoint. But from a legal standpoint, they're not going to be in a position, especially on this kind of timeline, to weigh the evidence, to say, well, 700,000 votes were improper, and so we need to take 106,000 off for President Trump and 283,000 off for Joe Jorgensen, whatever. Like, they're not going to be able to do that. So I think what most likely is, if it advances and if they are receptive to the Trump campaign's arguments, I can't see them overturning it in favor of either candidate, but I can see them sort of throwing it back on the Pennsylvania legislature to correct. And again, as I said earlier, I don't think that's bad for democracy. I think that's fine. You saw the national embarrassment that the hanging chads put on Florida in 2000, and they were one of the first to report this time around, right? They, physician heal thyself. They got their act together. Some of these swing states need to do the same.
Yeah, I agree. And again, whatever comes out of this, and ultimately, I'm not stoked about other guy winning. So this is not in any way partisan for me. I think when you're picking between the lesser of two evils, you're picking evil. And it's like we've got to get better people in here. I mean, goodness gracious, and yeah, that's going to distract me into something else. These legal fights, though, like the 7-2 decision, you're not hearing that in terms of, like, let's deflate this panic bubble. We've been through this before. We can take it, and we don't know. Like, so instead of pandering and saying the opposite of the president-elect, all this other stuff, I know that the candidates wouldn't do it. I doubt if I would do it too, but like a calm voice saying, hey, there's some challenges. I want to win this thing fair and square. Stand up and be like, you'll know if I win, and I believe I have, you will know it, and it will be a no doubt about it thing. But we're not hearing that. We're hearing a bunch of other nonsense.
No, I'm pretty sure that's what President Trump tweeted last night, right? Isn't that kind of verbatim what he said?
I didn't see this. I honestly don't pay that much attention to Trump's tweets anymore. But is that what he said?
No.
No. What?
Exactly.
Did he say I won? I'm sure.
Yeah. I think I won the election was trending, and I think if that is reflective of what winning is, I think people are going to get tired of winning pretty quick.
Is it up to the court to sort out? Okay, so we have a lot of, well, frankly, we have a lot of fire. It's not a big raging fire, but we have a lot of smoke. Like this kid who's the wrestler in Nevada/Tennessee, that is a problem. And then how do you in the time frame required deal with, like, look, if you want to, it's fairly easy to have a place in Tahoe on the Nevada side, and then your, palace down there in Santa Clara County, right? And you just vote in both places. It would be, I don't want to say it's easy, but it is completely possible to get a license in both places. And then unless someone looks, you can vote in both, or Idaho, or any other places where California voters might go. And I'm not trying to put anything, I'm from California. I'm just saying this is something, or Arizona, right? It's easy to do, to be licensed to vote, even though it's illegal in both places.
Well, you've got a lot of scenarios like that, or right. People with vacation homes or retirement, snowbirds. I grew up in Michigan, live in Texas now, but we had the snowbirds that would winter in Florida or Georgia, those sorts of things. And so you've always had sort of the opportunity for that. And what has always shocked me is that there's no system that deconflicts that sort of thing. Now, it's a big challenge, right? Because people move. We're a migratory society. So legitimate people are moving from, California to Nevada today. They were moving on election day. And so where do they cast their vote? Are they disenfranchised because they're in transit, or do they, those are reasonable questions. We should be doing a better job of trying to deconflict that out. It's against the law everywhere. But nobody actually is checking. Now, interestingly enough, and I've been tracking this, and they haven't really come out with any smoking guns yet, but one of the lead data guys on President Trump's campaign in 2016 pulled together a crew, and you may have tracked this. He got shut down on the GoFundMe because he was doing something so outrageous is to try to gather money so that they could buy the data, to put a bunch of nerds in a room with a database and a bunch of computers to kind of figure out, hey, is any of this kind of stuff actually happening?
Yeah.
And that was somehow, terrible. So GoFundMe had to shut him down. But that is an ongoing effort, and they actually were able to fund that through alternate means. And that'll be interesting to see because that's unprecedented. Now, I'm a kind of a computer guy. I've built an IT and computer security company here in San Antonio. It shocks me that that's not routinely done. Yeah. But the reality is nobody's done that before. So we're going to see from this election a lot of light shined in new ways. I hope the legislatures of the several states all take note. I don't want a federal solution for voting. I mean, that's the whole idea here is that we're 50 laboratories of democracy. But unfortunately, half a dozen of these laboratories of democracy seem to be exporting something similar to the Wuhan Virology Institute, right? This is poison for the overall health of our society if we're this careless with how our elections are administered so that we cannot. They might be completely proper. But again, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, the believability of the election is more important than the outcome from a long-term health of the republic standpoint. And on that measure, several of these states have absolutely failed.
Look, anytime the court is deciding minutia for us, we've all lost. Like the court will sort this out, and whichever way it goes, I know I can take it. It doesn't matter to me who's president. Like I'm going to be able to go do what I need to do. But we've created an environment where there is so much doubt, even when they decide. Imagine if. And I know this is a long shot, but this is it's kind of like in baseball, like, oh my God, what if 5 teams are a flat-footed tie at the end of the season? What do we do? And we just hope it doesn't happen. But the reality is today, right now, as we speak, there is an opportunity where we're 2 or 3 steps removed from, the votes of the people deciding this election, and it goes to, the state houses, and they start picking this thing. I think that's how it works. Either way, I guess what I'm saying, just for the audience in general, if we create this car crash, which is absolutely, there are cars on the road pointed towards each other. This is possibly about to happen. It won't be decided by the mass. It'll be decided because we failed to come to a conclusion. There was enough chicanery that it's going to go to a place that leans largely Republican. And then what happens? Like if we go to this juiced up conclusion that nobody wants, and then Trump wins, look out. I don't know if that's worth this. I don't know if that juice is worth the squeeze.
Well, so I would argue the opposite. Okay. In a way, because I think that's far better that we would have to sort of go to extra innings or go to overtime or whatever analogy you want to use there, and have the people's representatives, right? It's not illegitimate when because frankly our Constitution says that it's the state legislatures, and it used to be, we didn't used to always have direct election of president. So if we have to go back and those folks that are accountable to the voters in the state of Pennsylvania, for instance, or any of the other states, have to step forward and say, we need to clean up this mess, and here's how we're going to do it. And we believe that it's justified that we go for Trump or stay for Biden or whatever. I don't think that's bad. And in fact, I would argue, and this is sort of my thinking going back to 2000, is that a lot of the pain and the partisanship and really the growing bitterness in our partisanship is really due to unresolved trauma. And so having 7-2, well, there was still the 2, and the other 3 were corrupt, and they were, the reality is working through that in a constitutional way, even if it's non-traditional, isn't something we should be afraid of. And I think it actually has the potential to heal the nation. There will still be naysayers, but the more legitimacy we give the resolution process, the better. And that's kind of why I've always been, since the third, an arguer, or at least I've made the argument that let the court cases play out. I mean, why should we be calling the election early? That just serves a particular narrative that I don't think is healthy, because now half the country is disenfranchised by the media. Well, probably half of us were already disenfranchised by the media.
Well, they've got a bigger problem anyhow, because we're getting disinterested people, and that's why my show does well, because we're having a very sane conversation about a complex thing, and we're not going to profess to have the answer, but I'm not pushing for either candidate to win. We're just illustrating here, and the media is.
I would put myself in that same category too. I don't know what the right answer is here, and even some of these arguments about whether or not it should have been allowed to make it easier for absentee voters to vote. Is that bad? Is that bad? From an overall perspective. Now, time out, quick thing. What we didn't talk about in relation to that I wanted to make sure we hit on. It wasn't just stuff like signature verification. It wasn't stuff like you didn't have to even request the mail-in ballot. You got it sent to you. Those sorts of things I think people are familiar with. But some of the other things that they put in place either reduced the exposure or allowed it completely for things like ballot harvesting. And not everybody's familiar with that term, but we would all think, and I think we would all think, that if I'm a partisan activist and I work with the administrator at the nursing home to roll through and get 100 ballots and help all the people in that nursing home cast ballots, many of which, in my hypothetical here, aren't really particularly even there. Like, we would all think that's probably an abuse of the process, and that's illegal in all the states, right? But what are things along those lines that might be approaching that that were now permissible? Can I go through my neighborhood and help all of my shut-in neighbors that might not get out to the polls fill out their ballots? Well, if they fill them out themselves, I'm technically legal. But what if I'm, asking them 17 times and I'm going to keep coming back unless you vote?
Yeah.
And so what we did was we allowed a lot of those types of things to happen too, which I do think perverts democracy. And so this mantra that everybody should vote, I think is fair to say. But I do think we need to be careful where we empower and enable people that aren't encouraging democracy. They're pushing for a particular outcome to have more and more power. Because I've claimed, a lot of people have argued with me about this, but I've claimed that in some of these areas, we've put forward a de facto proxy voting scheme where you've got, the machine, so to speak, pushing people to vote. It may be pushing them to vote a particular way. And I don't think that's particularly healthy. And certainly dropping the security mechanisms that would have prevented that is not a good thing.
And the spy in me salivates at an opportunity to go out and exploit something for money. I personally wouldn't do it, but, I don't have a dog in this fight. If I had a dog in the fight, you better look out,
Well, so let me want your appetite on one of those things. So in one of the states, they took and said, you have to have your ballot, you sign your ballot, and you take your envelope, and you have to either give it to your county clerk or you have to mail it, right? We're going to assume the U.S. Postal Service never misdirects or otherwise mishandles mail. So,
right.
But in some of the states, they said, well, you can actually have these ballot drop boxes where you can drop your ballot off, and they're unattended.
Right.
So now I've got a prohibition that I can't take anybody other than a family member's ballot for that. Like that's the law. But I have a drop box that in the middle of the night, Joe can swing by with 100 ballots and dump them in the box. Nobody gets to catch him. There's no way to prohibit that. And so did that happen? I don't know. But it's reckless for whether it's the legislatures, whether it's the executive branch or the judicial branch, to allow rules that make those sorts of things possible, which make these sorts of conspiracy theories believable. And that's the real threat to our democracy, I think, is not being precise about this. So when we get down to the esoteric legal arguments and this and that, all this sort of stuff, this is one of those times where we really actually need to use our attention span a little bit longer, focus a little bit more, and hold these elected officials accountable. Because it's inexcusable that we're here 2 weeks after the election still arguing about whether or not all the votes have been properly counted. That's not a healthy thing.
Well, and the God's honest truth is why the hell is CBS, Fox, whatever outlet it is, why are they the arbiter of who won? I mean, the press has been wrong more than once on these things. And Joe Rogan has more listeners anyhow. Joe Rogan's not calling it for anybody. If anybody's responsible, he's, all of these guys, Tim Pool, Shapiro, these guys have hundreds of millions of people at some point, either they're multi-spins or whatever, but they've got a large portion of this audience. They're not calling it. They're like saying, hey, and then like you said, we can lean pretty heavily on our Constitution because it's proven to be, robust and should get us through if we like it. It's just, we're so desperate to kick one guy out of office. And again, why would you be excited about Joe Biden as a president? It escapes me. But yeah, it's crazy with the legal fights. And then let's also realize that once the ball is hit back the other way, I imagine that the Biden team is going to be like, and now here comes our lawsuit, challenging this and appealing or whatever. And then I wanted to add one more layer real fast. I know we're out of time basically, but we'll talk more if you want to. So the Biden, return of serve to say, hey, yeah, that was cute. Here comes our, litany of lawsuits. But also, yeah, you know what? Let's just go with that because I don't want to keep it too long.
No, I think that'll be interesting. So far, I don't believe, and I haven't done a complete analysis on all the state lawsuits for this, but I don't think the Biden campaign is an intervener in any of the cases. In other words, they're kind of letting it play out, and they don't have a dog in that fight directly. Surely there is some coordination that's occurring. I know they're tracking it very closely. In fact, all of the major law firms that are engaged in this are tightly, close to sort of the Biden campaign or sort of a more Democratic establishment. So they're definitely involved in there, but I don't believe that they're officially involved in any of the case. I'm pretty sure they're not. So that'll be it'll most likely they would be an intervener that would sort of get involved if these cases advance, would be what I would predict. So yeah, we'll see how that plays out. Like I say, I'm not invested in the outcome at this point in time. I think it's healthier for democracy if we let it play out. What we are now in this mode, though, is I think there's a great awakening of people that were not fully aware of just how much the media tries to force a narrative. I mean, it really is scary. If you just zoom back for a minute and look at what the media has been pushing, there's really no excuse. Especially on the heels of their failure for their polling, which is just abysmal. You would think this would be an opportunity to just take a breath. In fact, what's better than a protracted, prolonged, election from a rating standpoint? They would be having much better ratings if they were playing this out breathlessly, which is what you would expect of them. So it gives rise to the question: why are they so quick to call it for Biden on election night? Why were they so quick to call it on that Saturday, right? Which just so happened to be the anniversary of the first time Joe Biden was elected to the Senate in Delaware, right? So they want their storybook, I'm sure that was all just coincidental, right? Those are the kinds of things that people get upset about. And I think thinking people in the center, which I think the vast majority of the country still qualifies as thinking people in the center. Maybe not, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder. But I think thinking people in the center look at that and say, this is ridiculous. That is not a healthy thing for the democracy. So I think in summary, we're going to see it play out. I don't know how the court cases will play out. I think there's valid constitutional arguments for them. I hope they play out because this will illuminate the next thing. More importantly, I hope the people are awakened. I hope the state legislatures are awakened, that we don't have a process in place that gives rise to the trust that's necessary for our democracy. And honestly, the only way through it is through it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And then, and I'm not the first person to say it, but I like to say it a lot. If you think that voting is enough, look around you. Like your vote, you are at the end of the decision process. Go get earlier in the decision process. Get involved at your county, at your state level. You don't have to win an election to be helpful. to participate in democracy. If we don't participate, it will be decided for you like this here. I have, I don't even have a candidate that I like in this thing. And here's all this attention being shown towards it. Meanwhile, we still have legitimate problems. Meanwhile, we still have a Congress that can't seem to pass any significant legislation. We've allowed presidents to rule via EO, which is hazardous and chaotic, and we have, because the legislature won't declare war, they won't they won't use their checkbook to solve problems. The president and now the courts are all ruling by, their own individual process, and it's further eroding our ability to protect ourselves from ourselves. And I don't like it. I don't like that. I don't like that at all.
Absolutely.
Okay, man, listen, this was awesome. I really appreciate you coming on. Let's do more of these. Let's check in if this thing continues to go down the road. I have no idea what's going to happen. I just know this because of not 2020, but because of Donald Trump's involved. There will be chaos. There will be another twist and another turn after that. I don't know what the hell the Kracken is.
well, yeah. So the Kracken, it's either Rudy Giuliani is the Kracken, right? Or Rudy Giuliani is ushering in the Kracken. I don't know which it is, but Rudy was named the sort of lead counsel before the proceeding there that's ongoing right now. So I'm going to dive into that here as soon as we get off. I'll keep you posted. Thanks for the opportunity, man.
Yeah, I got to say one more thing, too. When we have legitimate journalistic pieces, right, with unsighted sources, which is a thing that we do in journalism, and they say, I found a person who admits to turning 7,000 plus votes and working closely to get people elected, and half of us dismiss this as like, oh, that's nonsense. But they will gladly say that the president said stuff that nobody else in the room says that he said, like this whole thing about, being Donald Trump has done more for veterans than any recent president that I can name, just through the VA of itself. And you're going to tell me that guy thinks bad about veterans? No. Okay, maybe he's an asshole. Maybe he's a jerk. But that story had no legs. Okay, let's say he said that stuff. Maybe he was joking. I don't know. But don't dismiss people, operatives, saying, I did this. Did they do it? I don't know. It is an unnamed source. Why would someone name themselves? They wouldn't. Who would ever want to go on the record with this stuff? We've got to do better. We rely on all of us here in the media. You're part of the media, too. You're writing for the Federalist. Oh, the Federalist, that's a right-leaning rag. No, damn it. There's smart people making these arguments, and if you can't take and read what smart things are being said, then we're all screwed.
It's good to be a gatekeeper, I guess, and the reality is that the alternative media, the smaller conservative sites, they're not gatekeepers. We might be cheerleaders in some ways. We might be opening up the aperture and talking about things in ways that other people aren't talking about, trying to break through. But the gatekeepers are still largely a very, very leftist bunch that I think the curtain is being pulled back on, not just a leftward leaning, but a very intentional advocacy for one side. The thumb is on the scale, and it's not just from, I'm just a little bit of bias, so I only look through it through this lens. No, I think they know what they're doing. And that's a whole nother topic, and that could be scarier for the future, because that fourth estate really is an essential part of the way that our national dialogue has gone forward for hundreds of years, and it's unprecedented the degree to which stuff is censored. It was tamped down. You see all sorts of news now coming out. I'm sure over the coming weeks we'll get to talk about Hunter Biden again, and Joe in China.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, yeah,
couldn't be talked about. That's bad. Just
that's
empirically
really
bad. Regardless of which candidate you want to see win, that trend is not going to serve our democracy well.
Well, I think, and I don't want to keep you forever, but I do want to make this point. We have to realize that the FBI has tarnished its own legitimacy, and it's not a whataboutism. It is absolutely illegal to have top secret SCI on your home server. There is no way out of that box. You can't say, "Oops, I didn't know," and then there is no Secretary of State that says, "Oh, I didn't know that was classified. I read that. And I didn't know." It doesn't matter. Acts of omission or commission doesn't matter. Once that goes down, I cannot look at the FBI seriously when it comes to political things, because I'm not saying lock her up or like that, but why isn't she locked up? Why? She admitted to it. She admitted to it. I take full responsibility. Good. How did you do it? Why did you do it? What damage did you do? Who did you get killed? Because without a doubt, if you have top secret SA, look, as a spy, if you've got a Chinese spy on your staff, like Dianne Feinstein or whoever else does as well, I want to know what the hell happened. Because if you gave me that source, look out. Look out. There's nothing that I couldn't accomplish if I've got an operative on a senior official in whatever country you want to pick. It's over. I will have my fingers in everything, slowly, just making things happen. And if it's happening on Dianne Feinstein's staff, it's happening anywhere in Congress.
Well, what you touch on there, Pete, is the failure of our mediating institutions, is whether it be the media, whether it be FBI, whether it be Department of Justice, in many cases, the military, intelligence community. We have these systems and groups that should be in place that we can trust. And that trust has been destroyed for good reason. For good reason. They've failed at that. And building that trust back is going to be a long haul. But it's not going to happen if we're not honest, at the scope of the problem.
Yeah. And if there's smoke, there's fire, and again, I'm not picking on Dianne Feinstein or the left. This, I'm sure, is China. This just in. China has the biggest intelligence organization in the world. We open a counterintelligence case against them every 10 hours on average. They are in everything, trying to compromise everything, to include the equipment they send us to we have to update our electric grid. Guess where we get a lot of our parts from? China. Guess what they are? Compromised. Why does the Department of Energy have counterintelligence agents? These are real problems. And if we can't hold ourselves accountable, and if we don't have someone to say, hey, these guys in these suits at the FBI are good people. That if your kid gets kidnapped, yeah, you probably got a pretty good shot. These guys are pros. But if it's political at all, I can't take them seriously. I can't take the news seriously. I can't take any of it seriously.
Actually, it's funny, just to plug my piece at the Federalist as well. I know you kicked it up in a link there, but if the audience goes back to that link and goes back the prior report that I released just before the election was on Joe Biden and China, in particular, what the overall process, and really not just Joe Biden, but the system under Obama, Biden, really is scary. And you see some leaks starting to come out right now that one of the things that the president might do in his final weeks in office, if it truly ends up being the end of his presidency here, which increasingly it looks like it's probably going to be, let's be honest, right? But he's already posturing like they're going to leave some of the breadcrumbs out for us to see just how bad China has been at trying to attack us along the way. And I think that's an airing that needs to happen. I think that's something that we need to take seriously from a national security standpoint. But we also need to recognize that, there are bad actors around us. Not every shadow is the boogeyman, but there are a lot of people that are out there with evil intent towards our great nation, and we need to stand against that.
Yeah, definitely go check out Matt's work on the Federalist. That link there. Just type in Federalist and type in Matt Beebe. You'll find it. And then let it be known here, I'm calling it for the winner. The next councilman in Matt's district is, in fact, Councilman-elect Matt Beebe.
I don't know about that, but thanks for the endorsement. We'll use that in the video.
There it is. Okay, stand by. I'm going to turn this thing off.